tō katoa. Ko Aotearoa, tōku waikainga, ko Rānana aho, ko Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, tōku mahi, ko Georgina, tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Georgina and I'm from the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, and it's an absolute pleasure today to be here to discuss the intersection of antitrust and climate change. To kick us off, I'm absolutely delighted to bring Stenji van Veldhoven onto the stage to open with some welcoming remarks. Stenji is Vice President and Regional Director for Europe at WRI, World Resources Institute, and former Dutch Environmental Minister. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, hello. So I work at the World Resources Institute, and the World Resources Institute for the past 40 years has been working on the nexus of climate, nature and development. And we have offices in about 15 countries around the world, and we work from a double perspective. We are a think and do tank. And we've launched our new strategy a year ago, and in that we put at the core of everything we do the interrelatedness of people, climate and nature. And as I deliver my words to you today, and you carry on with the discussion, please keep this in mind. We cannot save the climate if we destroy the forest. But we also need to internalize much more deeply that we will not get where we need to be, at the speed we need to be, if we don't make sure that our climate actions actually put people at the heart of what we do. Acting now in mitigation, adaptation, and guaranteeing loss and damage payments, in other words, in making that great transition to a world in which we can provide for 10 billion people within the planetary boundaries, is the best tool that we have at hand to make ends meet for everyone on Earth. But we will also have to think about how we do this, how we design policies and measures, because people around the world are struggling to make it to the end of the month, sometimes the end of the week, often the end of the day. Climate action cannot be perceived as something that makes ends meet even harder than it is now for them. So, for example, when we talk about the much needed end of fossil fuel subsidies, we also need to plan at the same time on how, in a different way, poor families will still get the same amount of support in their everyday life costs for their basic needs, so it's not the poorest that pay the price. Because as a politician, as a former politician, I must say, I can tell you that nobody will vote for you if we get that wrong. But we can get it right. I was asked to speak here today about the urgency of mitigation. And I feel it's clear to everybody in this room, and hopefully also to everybody online. And many more facts will be presented today on how we are quickly approaching those tipping points. Those tipping points that will actually destroy the balance, which allows us to exist on this earth. Sorry, this is not the optimistic part of the speech. I am going to get to that. But it's also important to know where we stand. And I deliberately say the balance that allows us to live on this planet, because the planet can do perfectly fine without us, has done so for billions of years. But the opposite is quite not the case. So there's really an urgency to build a planet that does not heat over 1.5 degrees. There's an urgency to put a halt to the 69% decline in species populations since 1970 that we're watching right now. There's an urgency to halt the loss of primary rainforests at the equivalent rate of 11 football fields per minute, meaning an area roughly the size of Switzerland in just 1 year. There's an urgency to rebalance the vast inequity in the world. Currently, the richest 1% of the population emit as much as, any guesses? 2/3 of humanity. And by doing all of this, and now we get to the more optimistic part, by doing all of this, we also get a world in which people do not die of sickness due to air pollution from fossil fuels. We also get a world in which people do not need to own a car to have access to good, safe, clean transport systems, including e-buses, metros and trains, but also walking and cycling, electric 2- and 3-wheelers. We get a world with clean, reliable energy for those nearly 800 million people worldwide that still do not have that. And we get a green and thriving environment, catering for our needs of food, clean water and nature. So in short, there's an urgency to do something less, but our aim should be to create something better, and we can, to build a better, fairer, more sustainable world. Climate action, especially mitigation, is a big part of what can get us there, and it's also a lot cheaper than adaptation. So, I'm sure that you've been walking around the COP here, and hopefully, if you're watching online in this COP period, but actually every day, I hope you're thinking as well, what can I do? Because there's no way we reach these goals if we don't work together. Every country, every sector, public and private, every company, big and small, all of us in this room and online have a role to play in building a better, more sustainable and fairer tomorrow. And together we can. And from my previous job, let me give you a few examples of how I've actually seen this happening if we are smart. Think about transport. In many cities worldwide, you have those diesel guzzling buses that are emitting these dirty fumes of emissions in the very streets where mothers actually stroll their babies. That is a reality in many cities today. In the Netherlands, where I come from, 1 in 5 children that has asthma has so because of air pollution. And that is something that we can prevent. By now, electric buses are coming onto the market. In India, so it's not just about the global north, in India, WRI was involved in a program leading to the purchase of 50,000 electric buses. And their price was lower than the diesel buses. And yes, of course, that had something to do with the, let's say, volume of the purchase. Of course, scale made a difference here. But even with smaller volumes, when coupled to the right financial mechanisms supporting both purchase and operations, that business case has a very good business case. And in the financial sectors, I mean, there's so many experts that can actually make it possible, because the financial sector, when it gets involved, they have the expertise. You have the expertise from the lawyer and the financial sector. You have the expertise to know where to find, where to look, how to schedule, how to make that business case. And of course, investing in such a business case can be greatly helped by a government setting clear rules for a phase out. And let's hope the text coming out of COP will have a very, very clear sense of direction. We should work together. Public and private investments aligning with public-private collaboration, setting a clear direction, and then working all towards it. And since there's too little funding, actually, too little public funding alone to fuel the transition, we'll have to think about how we can combine public and private funding in a much smarter way. We need to get from the millions to the billions to the trillions, and we can only get that done if we actually work together. Another example is in the energy sector, where we really see a tipping point. I think it must have been about 10 years ago, when I was in Parliament responsible for energy, when we were confronted the challenge to scale up wind energy. Of course, the Netherlands is a windy country, but we're also a densely populated country. And therefore, trying to scale our renewable energy ambitions on land created tensions, because people were afraid of having those big windmill parks close to their house. And so we started to look to offshore wind, because we also have a very shallow coastline, a windy, shallow coastline. But building that first wind park, I think the cost of it would have been like 9 billion euros, which is not a scalable solution. But then we got to work. The private sector that was interested to invest in the windmill parks, the government that actually set a very clear mandate. They said, this is what we're going to build, and then the financial sector. And we struck a deal between all of those, and they were going to lower the cost by 40%. And actually, so the first windmill park cost like 9 billion. But then the other windmill parks were tendered. And within a few years, there was no need for any subsidy anymore. That is because the private sector, in all of its capacities, got to work within the context of a clear regulatory framework that gave certainty to the direction in which we were going. These may also be seen as two simple examples, but it always seems very simple once it's done. And on the other hand, it seems impossible until it's done. Not all change will be part of big central government brokered deals, but we will need to make sure to see the market work. Because at the moment, we're still confronted with market failures in many sectors, as externalities are not priced in, and the playing field is actually leveling our speed. So we have to get smart. We have to get smart thinking how we can combine those forces. Smart about how we build a system of incentives that drive us away from a reliance on fossil fuels and extractions to renewables and regeneration. ensuring that we cater for all in the long term, while not forgetting the vulnerable in the short term. If we want to decarbonize through this collaboration between public and private, transparency and accountability are evidently key. And there are important tools for this out there. For example, the Science Based Target Initiative, right? Kind of the gold standard for corporate decarbonization standards and target setting. And that helps to create that level playing field. It helps companies to define their net zero pathways, creating the much needed transparency and accountability that then a public sector policy can also rely on, like the SECC did. We have to combine our forces. And this transition, of course, is as much in the interest of the private sector itself, simply because there's very few economies that will thrive in a climate crisis. Risks and costs will go up, and some risks will even become very hard to insure, and I think we're all seeing that happening already. So we have to get smart. Smart about how we combine our forces. And when I say we, I literally mean us. One of my very dear colleagues is Wanjira Maathai, and her mother was Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. And she said, the burden of change is on those who know. And we know. And so we have to get active. Also, because time is up. There is really no longer a possibility to think somebody that holds my position after me will deal with a difficult issue. Because however powerful that person may be, they will not have the power to turn back time. So it is up to us. We have a couple of years left. So I hope we get very smart, very collaborative. And if there's anything that the World Resources Institute can do to help you, we'll be standing with you. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much for your remarks and touching on a lot of things that our speakers are going to pick up on, so thank you. Now, technically, today's event is the launch of the ICC's Progress Report on Sustainable Antitrust. But we're not going to talk you through page by page. We're going to leave you to pick it up and read it yourselves. And instead, we're going to dive into an in-depth discussion on the intersection. We've got my incredible colleagues and friends to discuss this. Maritz Dolmans from Cleary Gottlieb, antitrust partner, who will be able to take us right to the crux of the law, and Fiona Macklin, Senior Advisor at Groundswell, Global Optimism, who's going to be able to give us some real texture and real-life examples of her experience with the subject matter. So let's get into it. To kick us off, Fee, you used to lead Race to Zero. You may be familiar of the Race to Zero campaign. But just in case everyone isn't, can you give us a bit of an idea around what Race to Zero is? What does collaboration look like for Race to Zero?
Thank you so much, Georgie. It's fantastic to be here and just an amazing opening as well. So much of the landing in the current crisis that we face, but also that parallel truth that change is happening. So thank you so much for that. And Georgie, Moritz, it's such a pleasure to be here. All the incredible and such necessary work on this is really energizing to see. What is Race to Zero? Well, Race to Zero was a campaign born in June 2020. Launched by the UN high-level climate champions back then for COP25 and COP26, Gonzalo Munoz and Nigel Topping. And those two figureheads are appointed, their position is mandated by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And essentially their role is to rally all the non-state actors, so the businesses, the finance leaders, the subnational leaders, and so on, in support of the government mandate of the UNFCCC. So what they were trying to do with this Race to Zero campaign was set the gold standard for what a net zero trajectory needs to look like for all those non-state actors, and actually just unite them, hug our arms around them collectively, so that we can demonstrate the momentum underway and the appetite for change. So a few, maybe three key sort of thoughts on what the campaign was looking to achieve. I think first of all, it was mobilization. It was really bringing these actors and leaders across the economy together to understand what they need to do to deliver their contribution on halving global emissions by 2030. But it was also really importantly setting this standard for what net zero needed to look like. And we whilst we've seen huge growth in the net zero term and it being applied and claimed, that's come with a lot of greenwashing. And so Race to Zero was also designed to try and help navigate what a good net zero target looks like versus one that is used for greenwashing. And in doing so, therefore, thirdly, I think the key purpose of Race to Zero was also to enact what the champions used to refer to as this ambition loop. So the idea that if we can rally non-state actors behind clear goals, they can then use their voice, their power, their leadership to get national governments as well to recognize that the people that they serve are really looking to drive change and want that infrastructure to be put in place in order for them to do so. So that was a little bit about Race to Zero, and I think really excited for this discussion because there's so much to cover. But I think essentially a real emphasis in this campaign on not just delivering on net zero as an individual company, but both delivering and contributing towards a global net zero goal and making sure that that delivery and individual net zero target is coupled with that really strong advocacy play that is so desperately needed in today's world to enable that collaboration between governments and private sector.
Thanks, Faye. That's really helpful in just getting a real-life example of the power of collaboration and why that's so important. So now we're going to dive into the law. So, Moritz, antitrust law is economic law. So to discuss antitrust law, you need to understand the market processes and economic mechanisms at play, those that cause the climate crisis. Can you talk us through this?
Thank you very much. Well, the person who wrote most cogently about this, and one of the earliest to write about it, was Nicholas Stern, who is now Lord Stern in the House of Lords in the UK, who wrote a paper, The Economics of Climate Change, in 2008. And he explained very clearly the economic process and the market process that underpins climate change. He explained that the cost of climate change, the social cost of climate change, are not included in the product's price and the services prices. So they are what the economists would call externalities. And that means that producers do not have market incentives to reduce those emissions because they're not priced. And consumers do not have the market incentive to reduce their consumption of these high emission products because they are not priced. So you see overconsumption and overproduction, and you see overuse of a public good, that is to say, the biodiversity, the forest that Stientje was talking about, the climate, water, clean air, and so forth. That is overused. And this is here in the quote by Sir Nicholas Stern, or Lord Stern now, that emissions represent the biggest market failure the world has ever seen. And if you go further down into the quote, he worries about a profound, or basically a catastrophic impact on the future. So that is the economic process that underpins what's going on. But then when I was researching this, I really got a shock, because it appears that these models that we've been working for until recently have dramatically underestimated the damages associated with climate change. And this became clear to me when reading a report by the British Institute of Actuaries and the University of Exeter. And they explain a number of points. The first one, and it's Professor Tim Lenton, I think, presented a paper, his report a few days ago here at COP, and he identifies 25 tipping points worldwide. For instance, the thawing of permafrost, which releases enormous amounts of methane and CO2, but also the boreal forest drying out, the Amazon forest drying out. And he thinks and that the subpolar gyre, which is an underwater current that goes around Greenland, it's not identified here, could stop in the next 10 years with dramatic consequences. So they explain in these reports, University of Exeter and the British Institute of Actuaries, that the models used by climate disclosures by companies, the TCFD reports, underestimate the consequences of climate, the damage that is possible by climate change. Second, they worry that these estimates tend to be based on past experience. And they give the Titanic, what I call the Titanic quote. He says, somebody standing on the back of the stern of the Titanic, looking backwards, saying, we've had a 25-day trip, no problem, we're not going to have a problem in the future. That is what he worries about. And then the third thing he worries about is, and this is even more worrying, is that these tipping points are interrelated. They present cascading risks. And the models do not only not account for tipping points, but also for how these tipping points are interrelated and reinforce each other. And because of the deep uncertainties that have been identified, it is now, they estimate that there is a 20% chance that current emissions of greenhouse gases, right, would get us to 5 degrees warming. Right? That could have dramatic economic impact. And worse, they estimate that we will have 50% GDP, gross domestic product, destruction somewhere between 2070 and 2090. These are actuaries. They are not adventurous people, let's say, they are intellectual, rational, careful, thoughtful, data-based, and when they come up with a threat like this, we really have to worry, because an economy, and therefore our society, cannot survive with 50% GDP destruction. So read that report of the actuaries, the Emperor's New Climate Scenarios. Read the report. There's an article that is kind of provocatively titled When Idiot Savants Do Climate Economics, talking about Nordhaus's model based on quadratic equations, dramatically underestimated climate change damage. And all our models have been based on Nordhaus's equations. So this is serious stuff and really needs to be read. Read that report, it is quite dramatic.
Thank you, Moritz. Oh, sorry, I think we might have flicked forward. That is terrifying. That is incredibly interesting. To read list is all growing. Moritz, can you pull this in with antitrust? What's the link here?
Yes, well, so we're all worried about regulatory failure. That is to say, we're all worried that at COP28 there is still not going to be a phase out of fossil fuels, right? That's called regulatory failure. So when you think about regulatory failure, then you think, okay, if the governments don't act, the private sector at least should act. And that is in the private sector's own interest. Imagine a pension fund. I have a simple diagram down there of 2 pension funds investing in a coal plant and a bunch of other assets. The red lines are damage caused to assets. So the emissions from the coal power plant cause a damage to the pension fund's own other assets. Climate risk, burning, flooding, wind, but also economic damage, collapse of economic certainty, a potential collapse of society. Those are very serious cause. And then in addition, think about stranded assets that you invest in and that you cannot get a return on investment, or litigation, climate litigation. But they don't only cause damage to their own assets, which is relevant for their own fiduciary duties, they also cause damage to each other's assets. And that's where the problem lies. Because if I'm a pension fund and I'm going to invest in fossil fuels because I think that in 20, 30 years' time they'll give me a return on investment and I can pay my pension beneficiaries from it, Fee has one too. And she is also investing it in this. She is not going to stop investing because she thinks, well, Maurits is going to invest. I'm not going to stop investing because I think Fee is going to invest. So we both continue, even if we both realize this got to stop. And this is called the collective action problem. Collection action problems are solved only through coordination. That is to say, either regulation, and we just talked about how that often fails, or cooperation in the private sector. That's where antitrust kicks in.
Thank you. Now, Fee, you spoke us through Race to Zero. Can you now talk us through how that all ties in with what Moritz has been speaking? What was your experience with antitrust?
Yeah, thanks, Georgie, and Moritz, just echoing there. I think that mindset shift that we have to flip into from understanding the nature of change and just how exponentially it can grow both in a positive direction and in a negative direction, importantly, was so clear. So Race to Zero, being all about collaboration and sort of rallying non-state actors, was very much a movement of movements. It was an alliance of lots of different partners coming together who were then responsible for managing their own members to meet these Race to Zero criteria that we set out. And I mentioned the Race to Zero criteria. These are how we defined what a gold net zero standard looks like. And they were established with a group of about 15 experts from across the climate community, across regions, who went through every year a really detailed and consultative process to establish what these criteria needed to look like. So very much founded on the science. And what we would do is make sure that we sort of vetted each alliance or partner organization that wanted to join Race to Zero based on those criteria. One of the main sectors that Race to Zero represented was, of course, the finance sector. And this came after Race to Zero partnered with the Glasgow Finance Alliance on Net Zero, which was launched back just before COP26 under the leadership of Mark Carney, Mary Shapiro, and Mike Bloomberg. And the idea was that very much this GFANZ, as it's known as, was bringing together the financial alliances, so the Net Zero Insurance Initiative, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, Asset Managers Alliance, and so on. And what really, where this connects back with antitrust was when we came to have our second round of criteria review with Race to Zero. And as I mentioned, this was extensively consultative, and we went through a long process of establishing what the science needed to be to align with 1.5. And it was very, very clear that across all scenarios, what we needed to require our members to do was restrict the development and financing and facilitation of new fossil fuel assets in line with appropriate scenarios, and across all scenarios that very clearly and explicitly included no new coal projects. That was very much something that we had been processing and reviewing based on IEA scenarios and others. Now, when this came out, we had a couple of instances where we started seeing attorney generals across the US attacking this standard and calling it out for being or threatening antitrust because of the way that it was demanding a collective unit to, according to them, boycott a certain sector. And this felt like the most perverse example of weaponizing the law against a collective problem that we were trying to solve. What I think is really interesting is that this came out and a few of us saw it and thought, well, isn't that ridiculous? And the language almost sounded like it had been written by a 12-year-old at school trying to sort of make a joke on climate. But it was really seriously real. And of course, if you receive that, you're absolutely and undeniably going to feel extremely threatened and very cautious, not just for your business, but for your employees and for, from an alliance's perspective, for all the members that you work with. So what's dangerous about this is that it then got picked up by the media, and the media turned it into a storm way out of proportion from what it, I believe, could have been dealt with, and it got picked up and rallied, and so much attention got behind this idea that banning new coal projects, or at least defining that as a net zero standard, was threatening threatening antitrust standards, became something that the media rallied behind, and therefore completely threatened the movement of Race to Zero and these criteria that were defining a net zero standard. So I think what's really important to sort of highlight here is that role of the media, and I think journalists have an enormous role to play in communicating climate change and communicating everything that you've been sharing, Moritz, about how change happens, the dangers that we face, and also in understanding what should be picked up, what needs to be dropped, and what is going to help us advance our collective action. And so what we started seeing I believe, slightly threatened, or because of this media coverage, was members from across the different financial alliances starting to drop out because they felt they could not, they did not have the capacity to stand up to these legal threats. So I think the key takeaway from this was that, again, I think it's another example of how the groups that wish to attack net zero and weaponize net zero are very well funded. They are very well equipped to target the people who have very wide reach, and they use a very threatening approach to destroy the net zero movement. And I think what was really revealing to me and upsetting, and something that I think collectively we need to get much better at, and this has been with tremendous support from experts thinking through how we do this, is how do we better stand up to these bullish threats that actually are, and Moritz, you'll know far better than me the extent of these legal threats, but it feels like this could have been dealt with as a threat was actually quite empty, and that we could have collectively stood up to and kicked the bully down before they took off. So I think really, really important that we can sort of get ourselves back into that mindset of kicking away the bully.
Thanks, Fee. And I think we can touch on some of the ways that also can help this situation. Standing up is obviously essential, but what else can be done? What do we need from our authorities to get clarity on this situation? So what you've described was largely stemmed out of the US. A sort of good news story. Moritz, can you talk us through what's happening in the EU and the UK, and where there's movement coming from the opposite direction or moving in a different direction than the US?
Sure, thank you. Well, competition law, antitrust law is there to protect consumers, to protect the markets so that they're efficient and that consumers have access to appropriate, say, for instance, insurance. And what we see, the result of these threats to GFANZ and the net zero alliances was that they withdrew from these climate net zero alliances, but also that climate risk is increasing and that insurers are withdrawing from certain sectors. State Farm General Insurance Company, for instance, withdrew from California home insurance because of the threat of wildfires and so forth, and there are plenty of other examples. Now, antitrust authorities in Europe realized that, and they started to think about, okay, do we allow cooperation in order to achieve antitrust goals, to achieve climate goals? Where do we draw the line? And they followed this thinking that where agreements are designed to resolve negative externalities, like climate change, and where they dare to resolve collective action problems, like the ones that I talked about, Fee and I both insuring a coal power plant, and neither of us wanting to withdraw because we think that the other is going to continue, right? That kind of cooperation, should that not be allowed? So we see the European Commission issuing guidelines on sustainability agreements, Chapter 9 on the guidelines on horizontal agreement, saying we're going to allow a series of climate agreements and other sustainability agreements. We'll discuss some of them a little later. And then in the UK, you saw the same thing. The UK 2023 Green Agreements Guidance from the Competition and Market Authority. There too, you'll see the references to collaboration between competitors needed to protect or enhance environmental sustainability can be necessary to resolve market failures. So this is actually quite helpful.
Thank you. And I think, collaboration can take so many forms. It can look very different. There are a lot of net zero agreements. Do you think that the guidance is sufficiently clear?
The guidance is, both the EU guidance and the UK guidance is very well written. The Net Zero Lawyers Alliance has a little slide deck with a traffic light system, which is partially taken here. And so you can distinguish between three groups of agreements. The first group of agreements is agreements which in the past may have raised questions, but which the Commission and the CMA say, no, these are not agreements that have a negative effect on competition. And I'll give three examples, or four examples. One is voluntary codes of conduct, like targets. Second one is sustainability standards, Say, for instance, Vera recently designed standards for carbon markets. That's the kind of collaboration between competitors that is within what's called the safe soft harbor criteria. Activist shareholder collaboration. This is a very interesting one, because there's a lot of interesting thought being given about shareholder stewardship, both micro and macro stewardship. If you're interested in this, Steve Waygood has thought very deeply about macro stewardship, about how we can use financial markets in order to get the transition into the climate. That kind of cooperation between shareholders to encourage companies to transition is now clearly green-lighted. Similarly, with, for instance, agreements to fund or insure renewables and nuclear. Now, there's a second category of agreements which are, you need to look into the facts. The amber light doesn't mean that it's not a red light. It's okay, look at the facts. Don't just clear them or prohibit them. Look at the specific facts. I'll give you 2 examples where you need to balance the costs to the consumers against the benefits to consumers because of climate transition, because of economic transition that reduces climate risks. One example is an agreed phase-out of unsustainable input or unsustainable production or unsustainable practices. That is now generally allowed, provided that the benefits, that you pay attention, that the benefits outweigh the cost to consumers. Similarly, an agreement not to finance or insure new fossil fuel projects. And I'll talk about an example later. That's also a kind of amber light agreement where you need to look at the costs and balance them against the benefits. Here is a little decision tree that we use for that balancing analysis. I won't go through all the detail. I'll just say that there are kind of broadly speaking 3 steps. Step 1 is there a market failure? And you can check that in the market, because are there externalities? Are consumers willing to pay for the full cost of transition? If not, then collaboration may be necessary. Does the agreement seek to solve the market failure? If yes, then you do this cost balance analysis. If no, if the companies are just using this for greenwashing or colluding to undermine regulation, like in the AdBlue case, then you have to prohibit it. So this decision tree kind of gets you there. And then there are the red agreements. These are the ones that are clearly prohibited. For instance, agreements between car manufacturers to say we're going to make the AdBlue tank very, very small and thereby undermine regulation, or agreements that are plainly price fixing, those are prohibited.
Thank you. And that decision tree and the traffic light breakdown is available, as Maritz mentioned. The Net Zero Lawyers Alliance has produced a Competition Law 101 for UK and EU and US coming soon. Yes, okay. So back to the US now. What do we need to see happen here? What do you think can help this situation?
Yes, well, in the US, the situation, when you look at the ICC report that's being launched today officially, all right, a number of cases are being listed. And these cases tend to be local agreements that are approved. Agreements in the UK, agreements in the EU, but you do not see worldwide agreements. And that's because of this antitrust threat that Fee was talking about. So in the US, however, the law is not different in principle, or, well, than as in Europe. We have done a review of all collective boycott cases from the Supreme Court in the United States. And what we see is kind of a gray zone, right? There are certain collective boycotts which are per se violations. And those are boycotts where Fee and I, for instance, collude in order to boycott you, to get you out of the market in which we compete. These are called horizontal boycotts. And what we see with these no new coal agreements, they are not horizontal agreements. The purpose is not to get a competitor out of the market so that we can then raise prices. The purpose is to deal with a collective action problem, with a market failure. And when you look at those kind of agreements, they are governed by what's called a rule of reason, a balancing test, where you balance the costs against the benefits. And why are those agreements allowed? Because the purpose of those agreements are not to raise prices, but to solve a collective action problem. And the purpose is not to exclude rivals. There are lots of other cases that are relevant for this. I'll mention one. I won't go into the details, but the Appalachian coal case, for instance, from 1933 already, where cooperation between competitors was allowed under a rule of reason in order to deal with market failures. So we think that even in the US, these kind of agreements are allowed.
Thank you, and I think we might come back to this in a moment, but I know that Fee needs to run off. She's got very exciting work to be doing. But Fee, you're from Global Optimism. Do you have anything to be optimistic about this situation? Closing remarks from you before Maritz and I go into Q&A with the audience.
Oh, thank you, Georgia and Maritz, and I'm so sorry to have to be running off, but it's all on the topic of collaboration. And I think with regards to Global Optimism, I think just a few quick thoughts. One is absolutely underscoring what we've been hearing today about the potential for exponential change in a positive direction. And we really are at a tipping point, I think, where we're starting to see, as we were hearing, huge change in power, in transport, in industry. And now is the time to double down on that, because we know that change just happens very slowly at first and then much faster than we ever thought possible. So now is the time, and I think specifically we often talk about this decade being the decisive decade. I would argue that the next 48 hours are, and this is the year of the global stocktake, and we need this rallying and collaboration to come together and understand what we want the future of our planet to be. And part of that is in redefining what these laws look like and specifically how they are used. So just incredible work that's going on, and really excited to see where that takes us. And thank you so much, and sorry again to have to run off, but have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Fee. Okay, Maritz, before I open for question time, is there anything else you'd like to comment on in terms of how what Fee was talking about with GFANZ and Race to Zero links with what we need to see in the US? Anything on that?
Well, I was wanting to give an example of a no new coal agreement, how that would be analyzed in the United States. And the first point to keep in mind is when the antitrust authorities in the US and also in Europe would review such an agreement, is to keep in mind that the carbon budget does not allow for new coal projects, indeed not even for new fossil fuel projects. And you see this here in this graph, which is already outdated because the budget is actually much smaller now than in the last few weeks. It now appears that we have 8 years left to have a 2/3 chance to stay below 1.5. But this budget graph indicates that without or with abatement, there is no room for new carbon projects. And that's hugely important. And here there's a study done by University of Oxford and Columbia for the IMF, and this is thanks to Peter Tufano, Professor Tufano, who's here in the audience. So thank you. He found this and alerted me to it, which studies the benefits and the costs of replacing coal with renewables. And this graph, this little table suggests the benefits. The benefits to the world economy of replacing coal with renewables are $114 trillion. That's, of course, the other side of the medal, saying that if you don't do it, that's the damage to society, right? $14 trillion. The costs of converting, mostly investing in clean energy to replace the coal, is about 29 trillion, and about 50 billion is opportunity cost to compensate the coal owners under a Gaussian analysis. If someone wants to talk economics, Peter is here. But the net benefits, therefore, to society are $85 trillion. Okay. Now, that's huge. If you want to do a cost-benefit analysis for a no new coal agreement under antitrust law, you cannot ignore these kinds of numbers. They are enormous. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the International Energy Agency has said that we don't need new coal, because people might say, okay, you're going to shut down these new coal power plants or new coal mines, but what about energy security? We need energy security as well. But there are plenty of other renewables available that can replace those, and they are cheaper these days than coal. Renewables, also one of my pet projects, thorium molten salt reactors, completely clean, safe, carbon neutral. They burn nuclear waste rather than creating it, and they're cheaper than any alternative and expected in the market around the end of 2028. Now, realizing that the benefits to society are so enormous and that you don't need those coal power plants, why are we still investing in them? We should phase them out, and this should be permissible under competition law. And that brings me to the conclusion then. It's basically that, well, the ICC report shows that antitrust is adapting to climate change. We also see that right now the precedents that are being approved in the EU and the UK are local agreements, because worldwide agreements are hampered by the threat of US antitrust action. That hurts sustainability agreements, worldwide ones, and the damage is potentially huge, and the benefits of clearing this blockage is enormous. So the lesson and the request to everybody is lobbying, even between competitors, to the US is clearly exempted under antitrust law. There is the Noor-Pennington doctrine that says competitors can get together and lobby the antitrust authorities to adapt their, for instance, their guidelines on competitor collaboration. Or you can lobby the government in order to get approval for a no new coal policy. In fact, the US, during this COP, already indicated that it supported a growing alliance between countries at COP to stop new coal projects. And we should support that and already implement that in private action and encourage the US antitrust authorities to support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritz. It's always such a privilege and a pleasure to speak with you about these matters. I've had lots of opportunities, both today and on other days, to ask you questions, so I now want to turn to the audience. This is your opportunity to ask a question, start a discussion. Is there anything from the audience? Yes, fantastic. And please introduce yourself as well.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting discussion. My name is Jean-Baptiste Baroni. I'm in charge of climate change within the French Business Federation, MEDEF. So this is very interesting to see the US perspective, notably in the discussion this morning, because of course in the EU, well, it's all the regional aspects still make a difference, but we are not aware of any legal disputes on these aspects in Europe, from my perspective, as long as I know. But in Europe, I would say the difficulties in the discussion are not legal. They tend to be technical, methodological, and having the right understanding on net zero standards, on the way governments, the EU Commission consider them, companies, etc., and trying to have this understanding. But what I see in the when the issue is blocked and the discussion, well, still it's a technical discussion, but the discussion is still complicated. What helps is to have everybody on board. I think there's an issue of having a broad governance of all these net zero mechanisms. And what we saw that in these net zero mechanisms being public or collaborative, when they were quite inclusive, this led to having something that afterwards can be used by all companies and all sectors, including SMEs.
I think that's entirely correct. And the beauty of these guidelines in the EU is that the companies are allowed to deal with these technicalities and methodologies and these standards. They're allowed to agree on what approach is the best practice and is the minimum approach that you should adopt for climate cooperation or for standards. Obviously, you can't go any further. You can't say, well, we'll set a standard here and everybody has to comply with that standard, and you can't do better for the climate. That would be a red-lighted agreement. But to say, this is the minimum that we all aspire to, and this is our target, and these are the common methodologies that we think are the best suited and best benchmarks for cooperation, that is now allowed in the EU under the soft safe harbor principles. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation. My name is Jody Ann. I work at the LSE Grantham Research Institute on Sustainable Finance. And in a past life, I actually sat through in the trenches with a lot of the Net Zero Alliances while this was all unfolding. I wanted to ask a question on specifically insurance and pension funds, as you touched on, and their role in not only for current generations securing livelihoods, but for future generations, and where are the legal and regulatory nexus or pinpoints that we can identify to make sure that we stay within the carbon budget as is an intergenerational issue, and think about future generations as well.
Yes, pension funds have, of course, particular fiduciary duty to their pension beneficiaries. And one of them is that they have to treat everybody equally, including future generations and young people who are currently contributing to the pension fund and who will draw out their pension only in 20, 30 or 40 years. They are entitled to equal treatment. And that goes to the very essence of their fiduciary duty and to the definition of sustainability, which is that we can use the Earth's resources in a way that doesn't prevent our future generations from using them and drawing the same benefits as we do. So that's what I try to say with this little figure here, is that this not only illustrates the collective action problem where companies are saying, well, I'm not going to clean up unless you're going to clean up, you're not going to clean up unless I'm going to clean up. We both want to clean up, but we can't unless we coordinate, and antitrust law gets in the way. But this also goes to fiduciary duties, because if you invest in a coal power plant and you then cause damage to your other assets and to society and to the economy at large, that will prevent you from eventually having sufficient return on investment to pay a pension to your young pensioners when they come of age, so to say, when they become 65 or whatever it is, right? Then you are not meeting your fiduciary duties. And in fact, that's what the UK Institute of Actuaries are particularly worried about. And I think in the slides will be available in particular also for people online who have not been able to see them. We'll make them available afterwards. But there is an increasing set of thinking about fiduciary duties and how this kind of thinking requires the pension funds in particular, but also insurance companies, to take sustainability into account seriously. And I quote, for instance, the Carbon Tracker article, "Loading the dice against pensions." I can give it to you afterwards, but it explains how this all works from a pension fund perspective, and how pension funds in particular, because they have such a long-term interest and are so interested in long-term return on investment, they need to take into account this risk that the actuaries have identified of a potential 50% reduction in GDP. Translate that into a collapse of society, because you can't survive. Assets will become uninsurable. The CEO of AXA said at 3 to 4 degrees warming, the world is uninsurable. If you don't have insurance, you don't have investment. If you don't have investment, you don't have returns on investment. If you don't have returns on investment, you don't have taxes. If you don't have taxes, you have no society. So this is a simple economic, and Peter, you can correct me if this, but from my kind of perspective, this is a simple reasoning why it is so crucial that pension funds, insurance companies, but also banks take this into account as part of their fiduciary duties. I could bore you to tears about Article 173 of the UK Company Act, or the Dutch equivalent, and to what extent, and there's the Shell case in the UK and the Shell case in the Netherlands, and so that's for another session or for afterwards, but clearly climate litigation isn't over yet. It's just starting. Look at, for instance, what's happening in California, where there's a state action against fossil fuel companies, because California says, you knew what happened in the 70s. Still, you continued with the emissions, you didn't move towards a proper transition. Climate damage is going to be enormous for California. The polluter has to pay. And so this is part of the fiduciary duties, is to prevent that and to minimize that. Sorry.
Thank you. We've got 2 more questions. And also, Peter, aware we've got your wisdom in the room. So do you have any comments on that?
So just a couple.
For the online audience.
I'm certainly not going to disagree with Moritz. He's an expert here. But one thing I would note is that the slide that you put about the great carbon arbitrage, that was before the US government set a $190 social cost of carbon. So I don't remember the number that they used, but it's going to be considerably better now as an ROI. Secondly, this is really a political economy question as much as it's a legal question. So an interesting kind of small question is, why did the Net Zero Insurance Alliance get blown up, but the other net zero alliances didn't? And that's because in the United States, regulation of insurance is at the state level. And my hypothesis is that state treasurers, who are the ones who wrote the letters to the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, had much more sway over what happens at insurance regulation at the state level, and therefore were more credible threat. And then I'd say third is that beyond the legal issues of antitrust, we have to ask another question, is how do we make these alliances more effective? Because once we tell them that they're not going to go to jail or get fined for what they're doing, how do we make them more effective? Because some are more effective than others. And so I have a new piece out that would suggest that perhaps they might want to disclose. We think that disclosure is a good thing for corporations. We think that disclosure through Freedom of Information Act is a good thing for governments. But these alliances have no disclosure requirements. So to the extent that we want to turn the thing around and say, not only how do we not stop them from doing their work, but we ask, how do we help them do their work better? It's one element among many that might want to consider.
That was Peter Tufano, professor at Harvard Business School. You might have added, because, but I completely agree. I think there are a few other aspects why the NZIA had such a difficulty, which is that insurance, in particular reinsurance, is a relatively concentrated market. And also everybody needs insurance, and therefore the potential consequences are more visible. And then you ask how to make these insurance alliances more effective. And your paper is very insightful in that. There is one other thing that I would add, and is that we need inspired voices. People like Günther Thallinger of Allianz, for instance. This is somebody who writes and thinks deeply about this, and who is able to explain these kind of things in a very cogent fashion from an asset owner's perspective. And that is very, very valuable, to have inspired business people thinking long-term about these things.
But Moritz, the one question when I put this recent thing together, at its height, I think NZIA accounted for 15% of the market, 1-5. So as an antitrust lawyer, would that be considered so concentrated as to open them up to the kinds of scrutiny that they faced? Because when I finally saw that number, it wasn't that high.
Yeah. Is that insurance or reinsurance?
That was all the members of NZIA. It was ceded premium as a function of total, or is premium as a function of total market premium. So
under the EU rules, that would be just above the threshold of appreciability. But I'm happy to be corrected. 15%. You'd want higher level of participation, because the higher the level of participation, the more effective the cooperation is going to be, and therefore also the greater the benefits to society. Because if the group is too small, it will not be effective.
Yeah, Emily, in a second. First,
Thank you. My name's Miranda Barker. I'm the Chief Executive of East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce in the northwest of the United Kingdom. Slightly sideways question from a non-financier and non-legal person, so go with it. We've been talking all through this week. We brought with us a cohort of technology developers who are trying to get their technologies into the global south without a debt burden going to those countries, so that they can actually afford to do a transition and not be saddled with a debt burden. And we've been concerned, as we've seen the week's discussions develop, that you've got the Just Transition team working in one room, you've got the financial team working in another room, and you've got the technology transfer and deployment team working in another room. And actually what we need them is all of them working together, so that you can put the finance into some way into the businesses, so the technologies can go into the global south as a just transition. And I'm not sure the politicians are making it work. Is there a conversation that can be had within the business audience, thinking about competition and antitrust and trying to develop a methodology from the business side to say, look, we can do this if you give us this easing of process? Is that something where we can see a discussion start so a solution can be presented to the politicians?
Yes, I think there's, and not only to the politician, also to private entities, to banks and insurance companies, to asset owners, to pension funds. If you can do good while doing well by investing in the transition in the global south. In particular, say for instance about this coal transition. This is particularly pressing in South Africa, in China, in India, where they say, well, we need this stuff for our energy security. How are we going to transition? We need the money. Where are we going to get it from? Well, they should get it from various sources. One source would be the banks, the insurance companies, the asset owners. They should invest down there in renewables, in India, in China. China can probably take care of itself, but in South Africa, which really needs this, right? They should also invest in new technologies like these fourth generation nuclear power generators, which are clean and safe and have no waste or can burn even the nuclear waste. That is a market. So if you agree as asset owners or insurance companies or banks to jointly or in competition with each other invest and give special attention, you get two birds with one stone, because you get a return on your investment, and second, you reduce the externalities of the coal burning that is otherwise going on. So it's an incredibly attractive investment for the private sector, and they should really think about that and pay attention to it. But there are other ways too. You mentioned politicians. Kristalina Georgieva, I'm not sure whether I pronounce it correctly, Georgieva, of the IMF. She recently gave a speech, I think 3 days ago. She talked about a combination of stopping fossil fuels, which are 7 trillion, anywhere between, depending on what you count, between 1 to 7 trillion, right? That money should not go to fossil fuels because we are funding the market failures. That money should go to renewables. And second, so that would be and second, there should be the Pigouvian approach, which is to tax carbon emissions. So combine taxation of carbon emissions and the transition of carbon subsidies to renewables, using that money to finance a transition. You could have a great private-public partnership financing the transition, in particular in coal-dependent economies like these countries. And you know, there are other ways, other things you could do. You could have agreements in order to have internal carbon payments. So a company could say, we're all going to calculate our carbon emissions. We're going to calculate the amount of money that is associated with that, the cost, the social cost of those carbon emissions, and we're going to dedicate that money to the transition jointly. We do this together because if we do it together, it can be stronger. We can be stronger. You have to be. So those are all kinds of ideas how we could help the coal-dependent and fossil fuel-dependent economies to transition. But there's one thing absolutely clear in my mind is that it can be done because the money is there, And it has to be done, because if we don't, we are stuffed.
Yes, absolutely. Emily, for our final question.
My name's Emily. Is it right that what you've described, so regulators permitting instances of collaboration agreements which would have previously been thought contrary to competition law, is equivalent to a challenge to the primacy of competition law principles? Because has it actually protected the consumer? It seems not on climate, and now it's being misused or weaponized in the US. Will we see the emergence of more regulated monopolies? I heard Lord Deben suggest this in the context of there's a tech company that can do something, which is a climate solution. Should we just let them do it? And do we need legislative change in the UK, Europe, and US to underscore the permissibility of business cooperation on climate or not?
So I don't think we need legislative change in Europe and the EU, or even in the US, because antitrust law is economic law. And market failures and collective action problems are a topic of economics. And if you base your economic law and your regulation on an economic model that is incomplete because it doesn't take account of market failures or collective action problems, then the law is inefficiently applied. I'm using polite words, right? I think Dickens said the law is an ass. I think that the current principles of antitrust law, which is the taking into account the efficient and effective allocation of resources and protecting consumers, including protecting consumers against the nefarious consequences of climate change, the law is already written so as to allow that. Now it's a question of applying it. Is that a fair answer to your question? Because you had several questions and I may have answered only one.
Yeah, thank you. It was just, in my mind, and I'm a beginner to all of this, competition actually doesn't, as practice, protect the consumer. So is there a problem with competition law principles?
Yeah, so I think the problem is not with competition law principles. I think the problem is with how they have been applied so far. And that's been resolved in the EU and the UK. And is, I hope, will be resolved in the US if the Department of Justice and the FTC agree with a request to change the guidelines on collaboration between competitors. You asked another question, whether what if, as a result of this, a company gets market power? The law is there that both, in particular in Europe and the US, that allows you to constrain market power. And in the US, we see, in the EU and the UK, we have Article 102 and we have Chapter 2 of the UK, and that allows you to ensure that market dominance is not abused and that no barriers to entries are being created. And so the legal structure to deal with potential emergence of monopolies and then those monopolies abusing that power, that exists in the EU and the UK. In the US, that is beginning to exist as well, because what we have seen is a shift in the US from Chicago School economic policy, markets solve everything, we don't need to regulate, towards what's now called the neo-Brandeisian school, where they say, wait a minute, we have to pay attention to market power, because market power is also a form of market failure. And if we don't take into account network effects and market failures and market power, we run the risk that consumers are being hurt. So you see in the US, in the cases that are being brought, a shift towards a policy that is more sensitive to concerns about market power. So I would again say it's a matter of applying the law, not of having to change the law. And that's a good thing, because in the current political environment, trying to change a law is going to be difficult.
So there's an enhanced role for the regulator in all this?
There is the regulator should apply competition law in a smart fashion, and these are people who understand market failures. Now it's a question of applying them.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So we are a little over time, so any other questions we'll need to pick up offline through in the entry there. But just a big thank you to joining this conversation and for such an engaging Q&A session as well. That was fantastic. Maritz, thank you so much as always. Such a pleasure. Wishing everyone a positive and productive rest of COP. And also, FEE really is somewhere exciting right now, so watch the the clock. At 12 o'clock, there will be an exciting announcement. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you. From Global Optimism. Thank you to everyone who joined online as well. And we'll make sure the slides are available so you can go through them in a little more detail. Thanks, everyone.